Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. The Alien Mountain Lion, adapted from a story by Murray Leinster. It was only a tiny scout ship from somewhere beyond the stars. Only one alien creature occupied it, but the ship's mission spelled life to its fellow creatures and death to all living creatures on Earth. Who knew that Earth would be saved by one terrified old man and his sheepdog? Join us on Sci Fi Saturday as we read The Alien Mountain Lion. The landing of the Quillin ship, a tiny craft no more than 15 feet in diameter, went completely unnoticed, as its operator intended. It was armed, of course, but its purpose was not destruction. If this ship, whose entire crew consisted of one individual, was successful in its mission, then a great race of aliens would come, wiping out the entire population of Earth before anyone suspected the danger. This lone Quillin ship was on a scouting mission, seeking a complex hormone substance which fed the Quillin. It had to be found in great quantity, and once discovered, the problem of obtaining it and mass-producing it would be taken up, with the resources of the whole race behind it. But first, it had to be found. The tiny ship assigned to explore the solar system for the hormone wished to pass unnoticed. Its mission of discovery should be accomplished in secrecy, if possible. The ship came to Earth, hovered lightly at the atmosphere's edge for a long time, then chose its point of descent for reasons that seemed good to its occupant. Then it landed. It touched Earth at night. There was no rocket drive sound to call attention, and by dawn it was well concealed. Only one living creature had seen it land, a mountain lion. Even so, by midday the skeleton of the lion was picked clean by buzzards, with ants tidying up after them. The Quillin in the ship was enormously pleased. The carcass, before being abandoned to the buzzards, had been studied with an incredible competence. The lion's nervous system, particularly the mass of tissue in the skull, unquestionably contained the desired hormone. It remained only to discover how large a supply of the precious material could be found on Earth. The Quillin in the ship prepared to take samples. The ship had landed some 40 miles south of Ensenada Springs, National Forest territory, on which grazing rights were allotted to sheep ranchers after considerable red tape. Within 10 miles of the hidden ship, there were rabbits, birds, deer, coyotes, a lone wolf or two, assorted chipmunks, field mice, perhaps as many as 3 or 4 mountain lions, one flock of 2,000 sheep, one man, and one dog. The man's name was Antonio. He was ancient, unwashed, and the official shepherd of the sheep. The dog was Salazar, a big white Great Pyrenees, who actually took care of the sheep and knew it. He was scarred from battles done in their defense. Besides these creatures, among whom the Quillin expected to find its samples, there were insects, many insects. These, however, the tiny alien being disregarded. It would not be practical to get any great quantity of the substance it sought from such small organisms. By nightfall of the day after its landing, the door of the ship opened, and the explorer came out in a vehicle designed perfectly for sampling on this planet. It stood on its hind legs, closed the door, and piled brush back to hide it. Then it moved away with the easy feline gait of a mountain lion. At a distance of 2 feet, no one would guess it wasn't a mountain lion. The alien explorer sat in a small cabin occupying the space that would normally be occupied by a real lion's lungs. The fur of the duplicate transport machine was convincing. Its eyes were excellent, its claws were retractable, and of a metal much stronger and keener than the original lion's claws. It had other equipment, including a weapon against which nothing on this planet could stand, and for zoological sampling, it had one remarkable advantage. It had no animal smell. It was all metal and plastic. On the first night of its roaming, nothing in particular happened. The explorer became completely familiar with the way the controls of the machine animal worked. As a machine, of course, it was vastly more powerful than an animal. It could make leaps no mere creature of flesh and blood could duplicate. Its balancing devices were admirable. It was, naturally, immune to fatigue. That night, Antonio and Salazar bedded down their sheep in a natural amphitheater in a rock canyon, and Antonio slept heavily, snoring. He was a highly superstitious sheepherder, so he wore various charms of a religious nature. Salazar, the dog, merely turned around 3 times and went to sleep. But while the man slept soundly, Salazar woke often. Once he was awakened by a startled squawking among the lambs. He got up and trotted over to make sure that everything was all right, sniffed the air suspiciously. Then he went back, scratched where a flea had bitten him, and went back to sleep. At midnight he made a clear circle around his flock and went back to slumber with satisfaction. Toward dawn he raised his head suspiciously at the sound of a coyote's howl, but the howl was far away. Salazar dozed until daybreak, when he rose, shook himself, stretched himself elaborately, scratched thoroughly, and was ready for a new day. The man woke, wheezing, and cooked breakfast, the same routine as every other morning. The small silvery vessel was safely hidden. There was a tiny flickering light inside, the size of a pinpoint, which wavered and changed color constantly where a sort of tape unrolled before it. It was a recording device, making note of everything the roaming mountain lion transport's eyes saw and everything its microphonic ears listened to. There was a bank of air-purifying chemical which proceeded to regenerate itself by means of air entering through a small ventilation slot. It got rid of carbon dioxide and stored up oxygen in its place, in readiness for further voyaging. Of course, ants explored the whole outside of the space vessel, and many went inside through the ventilator opening. Some very tiny beetles came exploring, and one variety found the air-purifying chemical refreshing. Numbers of that sort of beetle moved in and began to raise large families. A minuscule moth, too, dropped eggs lavishly in the nest-like space in which the Quillin explorer normally slept during spaceflight. Within a day, the small spaceship was basically flooded with all kinds of different insects. 2 hours after breakfast, Salazar found traces of the mountain lion. He found a rabbit that had been killed and carefully opened up, its various internal organs spread out for examination, and its nervous system traced in detail. Its brain tissue, particularly, had been most painstakingly dissected, so the amount of a certain complex hormone to be found in it could be calculated with precision. The Quillin in the lion shape had been vastly pleased to find the sought-for hormone in another animal besides a mountain lion. Salazar saw the rabbit. There were horseflies buzzing about it, and a buzzard was reluctantly flying away because of his approach. Salazar barked at the buzzard. Antonio heard the barking and came. Now, Antonio was a very superstitious man. He came wheezing, accompanied by flies who were breakfasting on the bits of his morning meal he had dropped on his vest. Salazar wagged his tail and barked at the buzzard. Antonio noted that the rabbit had been neatly dissected, but not eaten. The cuts which opened it up were those of a knife or scalpel. It was not, definitely not, the work of an animal. But there were mountain lion tracks all around and nothing else. More so, every one of the tracks was that of a hind foot. A true mountain lion eats what he catches. He does not stand on his hind paws and dissect it with scientific precision. Nothing earthly had done this. Antonio's eyes bulged out. He thought instantly of magic, black magic. He knew this was the work of the devil. He gasped and fled the scene. When he had run a good 100 yards, Salazar caught up to him, very much astonished. He overtook his master and went on ahead to see what had scared the man so. He looked to the right and left, then went in a conscientious circle all around the flock under his care. Presently he came back to Antonio, his tongue lolling out, to assure him that everything was all right. But Antonio was packing, with shaking hands and a sweat-streaked brow. In no case is the neighborhood of a mountain lion desirable for a man with a flock of sheep. But this was no ordinary mountain lion. Antonio noticed that Salazar had not alerted to the scent of the mountain lion. This only proved to Antonio that this was the work of a devil. He packed while Salazar scratched fleas and wondered what was the matter. They got the flock on the move. Salazar rounded them up and drove them on. It was hard work, but even Antonio helped in frantic energy, which was unusual. Near noon, 4 miles from their former grazing ground, there were mountain peaks all around them. Some were still snow-capped, and there were great views everywhere. It was very beautiful indeed, but Antonio did not notice. Salazar had come upon buzzards again, and that was the only thing that Antonio noted. This time it wasn't a rabbit. It was a coyote. It had been killed and most painstakingly taken apart to provide at a glance all significant information about the genus Canis, species latrans, of an adult male coyote. It was a most enlightening exhibit. It proved conclusively that there was a third type of animal, structurally different from both mountain lions and rabbits, which had the same general type of nervous system, with a mass of nerve tissue in one large mass in a skull, and contained the same high percentage of the desired hormone as the previous specimens. Some members of the Quailin race would have looked no farther, but the alien, being in the mountain lion transport, was off in search of further evidence. Antonio was hardly equipped to guess at anything of this sort. Salazar led him to the coyote carcass. It had been neatly halved down the breastbone. One half the carcass had been left intact, the other half was completely cut apart, and the brain had been beautifully dissected and spread out for measurement. Antonio realized that something with intelligence had been at work, but again he saw only the pad tracks of a mountain lion, and he was literally paralyzed by fear. Antonio was scared enough to be galvanized into unbelievable energy. He would have fled, gibbering, to Ensenada Springs, some 40 miles as the crow flies. But to flee would be doom itself. The devils who did this sort of work liked, he knew, to spring upon a man alone. But they can be fooled. The Quailin in the artificial mountain lion was elated. It had found good evidence that the desired nervous system and concentration of the desired hormone in a single mass of nerve tissue was normal on this planet. He could now guess the vast majority of animals should have it. Even the civilized race of humans have skulls with brains in them, and would most likely contain the same hormone. It was to be hoped for because large quantities of the sought-for hormone was needed. Tragedy awaited the race unless the most critically needed substance was found, and now it had been. An hour later, Antonio finally saw it. It looked exactly like a mountain lion, but he knew it was not flesh and blood because it moved in impossible bounds. No natural creature could leap 60 feet, but this mountain lion's shape did. It had stopped and regarded the flock of sheep, made soaring progression to the front of the flock, and came back again. Salazar had ignored it. Neither he nor the sheep had scented or alerted to it. Antonio hysterically concluded that it was invisible to them. Salazar found a deer carcass on the ground, and the smell of fresh blood in the air had the sheep nervous. He drove them on past the dead carcass, barking and nipping flanks where necessary, moving them away to safety. The sheep went on, but Antonio, when he came to the deer carcass, went icy cold in terror. The deer had been killed by a mountain lion, surely. There were tracks all around it, but it, too, had been cut into as if by a dissector's scalpel. But the job was incomplete. Apparently, the devil mountain lion had been interrupted by the approach of the flock. The tawny shape of the devil bounded back into sight among the boulders on the hillside. It leaped with infinite grace for impossible distances. Antonio knew he and his sheep were being stalked. Antonio considered himself both doomed and damned. Stark despair filled him. But with shaking hands and no hope at all, he carved a deep cross on the point of a bullet for his ancient rifle. Licking his lips, he made similar incisions on the other bullets he held in reserve. He was prepared to use any kind of magic he could against this devilish beast. The Kuei Lin mountain lion vehicle halted. The flock had been counted, now to select specimens and get to work. There were 4 new animal types to be dissected for the nervous organ yielding the sought-after hormone: a male and female sheep, the biped human, and the dog. Antonio saw that the devil mountain lion was watching him. He got down on one knee, fervently crossed himself, and fed a cross-marked bullet into the chamber of his rifle. He lined up the sights on the unearthly creature. The sight of a rifle meant nothing to the Kuei Lin, naturally. But the kneeling posture of the man was strange. The Kuei Lin had no idea what he was doing. Antonio fired. His hand trembled and the rifle shook. Nothing happened. He fired again and again, gasping in his fear, and he missed every time. The cross-marked bullets crashed into the red earth all around the lion. It could have easily slaughtered man, dog, and sheep by the quiver of a tentacle, but that would have ruined them as specimens it intended to take later, so the Kuei Lin simply moved the mountain lion vehicle with a single magnificent leap. It soared more than 100 feet uphill and over the crest at its top. Then it was gone. Salazar ran barking after the thing at which Antonio had fired, sniffed at the place from which it had taken off. There was no animal smell there at all. He sneezed and then trotted down again. Antonio lay flat on the ground, his eyes hidden, babbling incoherently in hysterics. He had seen irrefutable proof that the shape of the mountain lion was actually a fiend from hell. Behind the hill crest, the Kuei Lin moved away. It had not given up its plan of selecting specimens from the flock, of course, particularly the man and the dog. It was genuinely interested, too, in the human's novel method of defense. It found a lone wolf and killed it, verifying that this creature also could be a source of hormones. It also slaughtered a chipmunk and made a cursory examination, finding it, too, had this hormone. Earth was plentiful as a food source. Night fell. The mountain lion roamed the wild, keeping in touch with the tide of sheep now headed for the lowlands. It captured a field mouse and verified the amazing variety of planetary forms containing brain tissue rich in hormones. But the sheep could not be driven at night. When the stars came out, to move them farther became impossible. It found the flock bedded down. Salazar and Antonio rested. They had driven the sheep as far as it was possible to drive them that day. Though he was sick with fear and weak with horror, Antonio had struggled on until he could do no more. He made a fire, hoping the devil beast would stay away. Moths came and flittered about the flames, but he did not notice. He tried to summon courage. After all, the unearthly thing had fled from bullets marked with a cross, even though they'd missed. So Antonio sat shivering by his fire, cutting deeper crosses into the points of his bullets, his throat dry and his heart pounding, while he listened to the small noises of the sheep and the faint, thin sounds of the wilderness. Salazar dozed by the fire. He had had a very hard day, but even so he slept lightly. When something howled very far away, instantly the dog's head went up and he listened. But it was nowhere near. He scratched himself and relaxed. Once something hissed, and he opened his eyes. Then he heard a curious, strangled "Bah!" Instantly he was racing for the spot. Antonio stood up, his rifle clutched fast. Salazar vanished. Then the man heard an outburst of infuriated barking. Salazar was fighting something, but he was not afraid of it. He was enraged. Antonio moved toward the spot, his rifle ready. The barking raced for the slopes beyond the flock. It grew more enraged and more indignant still. Then it stopped. There was silence. Antonio called, trembling. Salazar came padding up to him, whining and snarling angrily. He could not tell Antonio that he had come upon something in the shape of a mountain lion, but which was not. It didn't smell right, carrying a mangled sheep away from its fellows. He couldn't explain to Antonio that he'd given chase, but the shape made such monstrous leaps that he was left behind, and pursuit was hopeless. Salazar made unhappy, disgusted, disgraced, whimpering noises. He bristled, he whined bitterly. He kept his ears pricked up, and he tried twice to dart off on a cast around the whole flock, but Antonio called him back. Antonio felt safer with the dog beside him. The mountain lion shape came noiselessly back toward the flock. The being inside it felt a little thrill of pleasure. Scientific exploration was satisfying, but rarely exciting. One naturally protected oneself adequately when gathering specimens. But it was exciting to have come upon a type of animal which would dare to offer battle. The padding vehicle went quietly in among the woolly sheep. It saw the tiny blossom of flame that was Antonio's campfire. The shape was 200 yards from the fire when Salazar scented it. The being's fur, now, was dabbled with the blood of the sheep, which had been its first specimen of the night, and Salazar could smell that. Salazar growled. His hackles rose, every instinct for the defense of his flock. He went stiff-legged toward the shape. Antonio followed in a sort of despairing calm, born of utter hopelessness. Salazar leaped for its blood-smeared throat in utter silence and absolute ferocity. He would not have dreamed of attacking a real mountain lion with such utter lack of caution, but this was not a mountain lion. His weight and the suddenness of his attack caught the operator by surprise. The shape toppled over. Then there was an uproar of scared bleatings from the sheep nearby, and bloodthirsty snarlings from Salazar. He had the salty taste of sheep blood in his mouth and a yielding plastic throat between his teeth. The synthetic lion struggled absurdly, trying to regain an upright position. That took time, giving Salazar enough time to take purchase and shake the throat savagely. In fact, Antonio was within 20 yards when the Quailin got its vehicle upright. Just then it saw Antonio. For an instant the Kuei Lin was alarmed. Antonio's fingers, contracting as the shape moved toward him, did an involuntary thing. They pulled the trigger of the rifle. It went on into the shape of plastic and metal, hit a foreleg. The bullet smashed through plastic and magnesium, struck a spark upon the steel. There was a flaring, sun-bright flash of flame, a dense cloud of smoke. The mountain lion shape leaped furiously, which dislodged Salazar and sent him rolling. The mountain lion vehicle landed and rolled over and over, one front leg useless. For an instant, deadly rage filled the tiny occupant of the cabin, where a mountain lion's lungs should have been. The Kuei Lin ceased the thrashings of its vehicle. Salazar raced up to it, barking and trying to tear into the thing again. The vehicle rose on its hind legs and raced up the hillside toward its hidden ship. Within an hour, it clawed away the brush from the exit port, crawled inside, and closed the port after it. As a matter of pure precaution, it touched the takeoff control before it even came out of its mountain lion-shaped vehicle. The ventilation opening closed very nearly. The ship rose quietly and swiftly toward the skies. Its arrival had not been noted. Its departure was quite unsuspected. It wasn't until the Kuei Lin touched the light switch for the ship's system of internal illumination to go on that anything appeared to be wrong. There was a momentary arc and darkness. There was no interior illumination. Ants had stripped insulation from essential wires. The lights were shorted. The interior of the ship was a crawling mass of insect life. There were ants and earwigs, silverfish and mites, spiders and centipedes, praying mantises and beetles. There were moths, larvae, grubs, midges, gnats, and flies. The recording instrument was shrouded in cobwebs and hooded in dust, which was fragments of the bodies of the spider's tiny victims. The air refresher chemicals were riddled with the tunnels of beetles. Crickets devoured plastic parts of the ship and chirped loudly. And the controls! The controls! Insulation stripped off here, brackets riddled or weakened or turned to powder there. The ship could rise, and it did, but there were no controls at all. The Kuei Lin went into a rage. The whole future of its race depended on the discovery of an adequate source of a certain hormone for food. That source had been found. Only the return of this one small ship was needed to secure the future of 100,000-year-old civilization. And it was impeded by the insect life of the planet left behind. Insect life so low in nervous organization that the Kuei Lin had ignored it. The ship was already 20,000 miles out from Earth when the Kuei Lin felt a vague discomfort. It felt itself growing weaker, more difficult to breathe. Moving ever more feebly, the Kuei Lin managed to get lights on within the ship again. Then it found the cause of its increasing weakness and spasmodic gasping breaths. It had acquired fleas and ticks, which were now happily inhabiting the Kuei Lin. The Kuei Lin tried desperately to remain alive until a message could be given to its people, but it was not possible. The little silvery ship never came out of orbit. It went on forever, or until its source of power failed. The fleas and ticks had a happy feasting ground, very full of Kuei Lin body fluid, and they never had a chance to report to their fellows that the Kuei Lin were very superior hosts. Back on Earth, morning came. The sun rose slowly and the dew lay heavy on the mountain grasses. Far away peaks were just beginning to be visible through clouds that had lain on them overnight. Antonio still trembled, but Salazar slept. When the sun was fully risen, he rose and shook himself, stretched elaborately, scratched thoroughly, shook himself again, and was ready for a new day. When Antonio insisted that they drive the flock on toward the lowlands, Salazar assisted. He trotted after the flock and kept them moving. That was his job.